All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Nicolas. Thank you, Kenneth, for the introduction. So, let's start. So, have you ever seen a brand's elegant display font try to survive a 1-inch embroidery on a trucker hat? It's basically like watching a cat trying to swim. You know it technically can, but it looks uncomfortable the whole time while it's doing it. I work with some of the world's biggest brands, and a big part of my job, the part that nobody really tells you about, is being the person who walks into a meeting and saying that, hey, I love the new identity, I love the word mark, I'm a really big fan of this custom serif, but quick question, have you guys ever tried to silkscreen this into a beer koozie? And then you literally see it in everyone's eyes. The brand team has never thought about a beer koozie in their life. They're living in a 4K Figma file, and then the grid is turned on and everything, and then here I am. It's just like a goblin from production, just ruining everything, right? So today I want to talk about that gap, which is the space between typography as it's designed and typography as it's experienced. In a deck, your font is the hero. In a deck, your font is lighting, and it has a soft drop shadow and a 1920 pixel artboard, but in real life, your font has to survive a foam can cooler at a backyard in July next to a mustard stain viewed by someone with 1.5 eyes open, and that's a totally different brief. So, okay, nice. Let's talk about who I am first. I'm a designer at Billboard Worldwide. We're an agency that turns brand identities into physical experiences. So things like apparel, packaging, event merchandise, custom promotional items, the thing that the brand in turn hands you at a sponsored 5K, you know, like the thing that, like your hat that your dad wears unironically, those type of things. Most of what I design ends up being worn, held, walked past, or thrown across a beach. We call this category merch, but I prefer to think about it as brand particles. It's tiny pieces of an identity blasted out into the wild, floating through everyday life. So think about like a crow and a hat at a bar or a Coors koozie at a tailgate. Each one is a typography decision, and each one is somebody's word mark, somebody's display face, and somebody's beautiful custom letter forms trying to survive contact with the real world. So we work across categories from mass market, beer to luxury furniture, beverage to sports leagues, and every project comes with the same core question. How do you take a font that was designed to look stunning in a pitch deck and try to make it look good on a keychain, or a beach towel, or a glass, or a duffel bag, or my favorite from last year, the Coors Light neon sign right in the middle over there? That's what this talks about, not typography as theory, but typography as a contact sport. So the challenge is basically when typography, when you think about it in the digital world, it's very clean, scalable, and predictable. You hit Command plus, and then the letters get bigger, and you hit Command minus, and the letters get smaller. The kerning never changes, and life is good. But in the physical world, typography often hits friction, sometimes literal friction. So I just want to walk through some of the greatest hits about this, and I'll be passing around some items to take a look at as well. So yeah, let's grab them here. Okay, so let's talk about embroidery. Embroidery is, think about it as like the witness protection program for thin typefaces. If you have like a beautiful Didone font with hairline strokes, the embroidery gives you a vague suggestion of a letter. The thin parts vanish and the thick parts grow, and your tasteful contrast becomes kind of like a ransom note. Tight tracking is also usually a death sentence. Embroidery has a minimum stitch density, which not a lot of people know, which means letters need physical breathing room or they fuse into kind of like a giant blob. I once watched a brand's logo get embroidered with such tight kerning that the R and the N merge with something that kind of looked unsettlingly like an M, and the whole word just changes. So now you're basically selling like a different product at that point. And then condensed fonts, they usually come out looking like Morse code that's left in the rain, and basically a rule of thumb is if your font is any feature that requires precision, you have to be careful, because embroidery, if you're going to put on merch, embroidery is going to find it, and embroidery is usually going to kill it. So print process, the second part. A font might usually look amazing on a mock-up. Your sans serif is crisp, your counters are open, you know, the letters are sharp enough, and then it hits screen print or DTF, directive to film, or pad printing, and suddenly your sharp sans serif is bleeding out at the edges, and the counters are starting to fill in. The thin strokes start to get stout, and different processes have different personalities. Screen print wants to fill in your counters, and embroidery tries to thicken your strokes a little bit. And then like foil, that's like a totally different material. It tries to do whatever it wants because foil is like really chaotic to deal with. And every process, you can think about it as like having a tax. So the smaller the surface that you're printing on, the higher the tax. Neoprene is another material that we often use. I once watched a perfectly nice branded word mark get heat pressed onto a neoprene can cooler. Neoprene is basically like the spandex of the merch world. It's like a very stretchy material. So the font was applied flat when it was printed, but the cooler is wrapped around a can, so it's circular. And now the font's no longer flat, and the font is being curved, right? It's warped. And the word mark looked like it was deep fried or something. So let's move on to budget constraints. This is like a real conversation that I have at least twice a month. The client wants their full logo, the full tagline, and 3 lines of legal copy. They want it on a 2-inch bottle opener. They want it in one color and printed. And then they have a budget of like 49 cents per unit, right? And then you have to get out a calculator and calmly try to explain that there's no way that we're doing all these things. We have to pick and choose, right? Maybe we try to lose the tagline, or we try to ditch the spacing. We try to go all caps to just gain a little bit of real estate. And then maybe the legal copy has to live in the back. And then sometimes the answer is just the font has to change, because usually you can't use the brand signature serif, because at this size, at this specific process, on this material with this budget, the serifs becomes a war crime against legibility, and that's a really hard email to send. And then legal copy. That's probably the most annoying part, because if you ever had to fit 3 lines of legal text under a logo on a 2-inch surface, you know the pain, because fonts don't shrink evenly, right? Some have really nice X heights on a mock-up and stay readable down to absurd sizes, but others get really ugly quickly. Like they were designed exclusively for billboards, or they cannot even be conceived. Oh, I think something happened. All right, let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about vibe management. So this is the one that nobody warns you about. Oh yeah, you can just, so one day think about like you're designing for a brand at a summer beach party. That's kind of the vibe that you're going for this deck. And then next day you're working for the same brand, but it's for their luxury ski lounge activation, right? So it's basically like two different vibes, but the same brand guide, same approved typeface. The font technically applies for both of those cases, but if you don't handle the weight, spacing, and the case properly, then it feels wrong in a way that nobody can really articulate. So in the form of an email with a subject line, it's not really just a vibe, right? It's more like a vibe delivery system in that case. And the delivery is most of the work. So that's about it for that. I want to talk as well about brand guidelines in real life, because that's where the real tension is. Brands want consistency. So physical products, they often demand flexibility, and those two things fight all the time in my inbox. You get handed a brand guide, and then people are talking about, like the first few pages is like a photo of mountains, mood boards, a page about the soul of the brand, and then somewhere around like page 50, page 60, the rules show up. It's like always use this specific typeface, or always use this spacing, or the X height has to be like exactly this distance, never alter this lockup. Like we've all seen it, right? But you have to think about it now that this is going on a baseball cap with a 1.25-inch embroidery field, and it's also going to be curved, and it's going to have a button on top as well. So you get on the phone, and then you have a conversation with the brand team, and then it goes something like, hey, if we don't adjust this kerning, it's going to look like a typo. And then they respond like, you can't adjust the kerning against the brand guide, right? But then you have to respond like, if we don't adjust the kerning, your customer is going to think your brand is named something different than your actual brand name. And then they kind of like, they can't really respond to that anymore. They're like, okay, walk me through this kerning thing again. And that's basically most of my job. It's just professionally being a kerning translator. So sometimes we also create alternate lockups, because the brand guide doesn't always do these things. You kind of have to confirm with them in an email. And these things are like a merch lockup, a smaller format lockup, an embroidery safe lockup. then usually gets added to the brand guide as the new page. We also sometimes try to add a filter or like a texture, not because the brand wants it, but because the texture forgives the printing process a little bit better. And then sometimes we just go all caps, because all caps, it's kind of like a cheat code. All caps fixes embroidery, it fixes legibility at small sizes, but it doesn't really fix the brand team's feelings. But like, you slowly win that one over time in conversations. I once had to rework a luxury serif, so it didn't really look out of place on a hoodie at a music festival. So we tried to keep the proportions, we kept the spirit, and we dropped some of the fanciest details and added just like a touch more weight. And the result still felt like the brand. It just felt like the brand loosened its tie a little bit, you know? And that's kind of the whole game. It's not about breaking the brand, but it's about translating it for the space that it's in. A font on the screen, it's like one performance, but the same font on a coffee mug is like a totally different one. The same font on the side of a delivery van is like another performance, and then they all have to feel like the same character, but we know that they're playing different roles. Okay, so typography, for me, it's a lot more than just aesthetics. It's a key part of how a brand is felt in the real world. Usually a font can feel premium or cheap or approachable or even cold, but if it's handled with care, and only if you ignore the material, the size, the process, the context, the font really does none of those things. It just kind of sits there looking sad on a tote bag in a thrift store or something. But designers, especially brand designers and digital designers, they need to think beyond the screen as well. They need to think about how the type is going to live on what material and at what size. Because when type leaves the screen and it leaves the safety of Figma or Illustrator, it gets tested a lot. It gets stretched or curved and printed at 50% opacity by accident. It happens actually a lot more than you think, because when somebody on the press night had a long week and when it's in someone's hand on a towel, then that's when typography really becomes real, right? So here's my final thought. Typography doesn't live on screens, it lives in the real world. So once you really understand that, that's when you stop designing fonts to be read and you start thinking about how fonts are being experienced. So that's really it for my presentation. Thanks for coming out. My name's Nicolas. I have some QR codes on the screen if you want to connect. My portfolio is on the right, and social links are on the bottom as well. My agency's QR codes on the left if you guys are interested in reaching out about merchandise or branding. And if you ever want to argue about whether your word mark can survive a hat, then I'm down to talk afterwards. I'll stick around for a little bit. So yeah, that's really it. Are we going to open it up for some questions then?
I'll just grab this one. Yeah, we don't have to save that argument for after necessarily, so we'll take some questions and some people can jump right into that. So do we have any questions for Nicolas about like the production process? I think is really interesting, or like prepping artwork, or just the scale he's doing things at? Yeah, sure.
Have you ever designed any typefaces, or like have you ever experimented with like type design?
Yeah, I have experimented. I haven't designed one personally. There's actually a website that I used before. It's called Typograph. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but I think it's called typograph.com. And then it's actually like an AI type builder. So you kind of just like tell the AI what you want to design, and then it spits out a typeface, and then you can adjust like certain traits about the font to kind of get it exactly how you want. But yeah, like I've never personally designed one before. I've just kind of like played around with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have another question? I know one thing that I thought of when you were giving the presentation, like sometimes design teams will do something where they have like a micro version of the logo or like a pre-adjusted version of the logo. Mm-hmm. Like what happens when you encounter that? Is that realistic, or is it still always based on materials?
Actually, a lot of the time we try to get, like, it's a lot of trial and error, to be honest. So when they have like a small lockup version, like I said, like in their brand guidelines, they might have like a version specifically for smaller, or like a vertical lockup because their logo is like too wide, right? So usually you'd kind of just have to send it off to the factory to see what it looks like, and then they respond like, okay, this is not going to work out. So in that case, you just have to like readjust it yourself and then send it over to the brand team for approval. And then that's kind of like where the back and forth happens. Like it's kind of a conversation on how should we manipulate this so it still fits the brand, but it also works for this material or whatever the thing you're designing.
Right. So like a bit of both plus some proofing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Like it's a long process.
Yeah. Back here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was really intrigued by the headaches that you talked about.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's one there that you've gotten really good at solving, and how you did that to get to that. Thank you.
To be honest, out of all of them, I would probably be using legal lines, because my agency works with a lot of alcohol companies, and then they always have like a please drink responsibly on it. And then they also have like their branding things, like the registration, the corp, like where it was incorporated, like the location. And it's a lot of text. And then they often try to include it somewhere on like really small items, right? And then at that point, like, let's say you're trying to include on a beer koozie, where do you put it elegantly so that it doesn't look ugly? Because like your logo's right there, but then under it, you have like all this text, right? So it's kind of just like a give and take about what you can cut out and what you can't. So usually for those type of things, like you try to print it on the inside, like just hide it a little bit, because it's not very elegant having a legal line right next to the logo, right?
Do we have one more? Yeah. Oh, got two more. Well, let's do both.
Do you have a stash of items that went really awry in your house, of like the worst things possible?
Yeah. I have a really big stash. Like, we have 6 closets. We have a warehouse, and then there's like 2. Like, just think about like one whole palette of failed things. But it's not just like failed typography things. It's also things that didn't make it into production. So like my agency process, we go through like many rounds of approval, and then at some points, like it kind of just gets cut off. But it's not all typography fails, but yeah, I have like a huge stash. This is just like kind of a sneak peek of the failures.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering about, like you mentioned, this translation between the typography in terms of, for example, embroidery or other kind of applications. And you mentioned the kerning as an important part. But I think it's, to my understanding, it's very complex process, because you have to translate that, and sometimes you can see the final result until it's done. Yeah. So in that sense, how you normally approach that? Do you have like a process, or it's based on your previous experience that you have with other projects that you developed before, or how it is?
I think slowly it just becomes kind of an instinct, because after seeing so many things get printed, then you kind of know what size it's allowed on, what pixel size. Like you kind of understand the ratio. Kind of like I can even talk about when I was starting out at the agency. My manager was telling me a lot, like, okay, we cannot print this on this because it's gonna, like, the result's not gonna work. And you kind of just like slowly learn that over time. But a lot of it can also be like to be honest, I could have just figured it out myself. Just visualizing the object in reality and then imagining the typeface on it. A lot of things that we do, because we also do like displays, you can print them out and then cut it up and then just like build it yourself. So that you build a die line, then you kind of just build it together. And then if it works for a small format like that, then most of the time it's going to be okay for like larger formats when it actually gets produced. So yeah, like it's basically just trial and error and just like slowly building up that instinct, I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much for the presentation, Nicolas. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I know if I'm enjoying a beverage over the summer now and I've got it in a beer koozie, I'm not going to be looking at that the same way. So.